Hi, and welcome to this first seminar for the Security and Cryptography module. So in this seminar, we will discuss the transition from cryptography to security, i.e. how we can obtain certain notions of security using primitive cryptographic operations. So first of all, what is encryption? Okay, so encryption in reality is a one-way trapdoor function whereby if you give me a message M, which is some kind of perhaps a clear text message, then the result of the encryption will be some sort of a random number that obscures that message. Okay, so there are a lot of algorithms and tools that perform this. From our point of view, what we care about is just the notation, or let's say the abstract form of these encryption algorithms. Okay, so we represent that with the following notation. We say that M enclosed with these curly brackets essentially represents the encryption of M using a key K. Okay. So in reality, encryption is, as I said, is reversed. So it's a trapdoor function. If you hold the right key, you can then sort of regenerate back or extract back the original message. So if I have this encrypted message M with the key K, I can extract M back if I have, or if I hold the key K. Okay, so in other words, or in more kind of practical terms, this will turn, or the decryption operation will turn this sort of obscure random number back into our nice original message M. So because I'm here talking about one single key to encrypt and decrypt a message, this reflects a model of cryptography that we call symmetric cryptography. Okay, so the idea that it's the same key you're using for encryption and for decryption. Now, there is a very important property here that the group, or whichever group that shares the key, will be able to essentially communicate using securely using such model of cryptography, and that group could be two entities, two people, two machines, but it could also be more than two entities or two machines. Okay, so it could be any number n of people who all have access to this key K and can use it for performing secure communications, so encrypting and decrypting messages. Okay. If it's a two entity group, then it's a one-to-one communication. If it's a n number of people or n number of machines in the same group, then it becomes a many-to-many communication. Okay, so you can have communications going in all sorts of directions. As long as you hold that key K, you're able to send something in a secure way and obtain it afterwards at the other end. So there's a couple of rules here that we want to establish. First of all, that K is known to all members of the group. Okay, so if the group is set so that it communicates securely, then that implies that the group will have access to this key K. And the other thing that we also establish here is that K is not known to anyone outside the group. Okay, so anybody who's not in the group, who's not authorized to be in the group, will not have access to this key K. And one of the things that we stress here is that because we're looking at the design of these systems, we're not looking at the implementation issues. Okay, so you, of course, you can brute force, you can leak keys, but those are all implementation, low-level implementation issues, which have their own solutions. But of course, in order for us to, first of all, design a system or kind of lay down the definition of the system and the specification of the system, we have to assume that security works or cryptography works in an ideal way. Okay, so it's a utopian world in the sense that we are not here dealing with issues related to brute force attacks, statistical attacks, or accidental or malicious leaks of keys. We are assuming that everybody respects the rules that we are going to lay out as we move on in our definitions. So what kind of security guarantees do we have when we say that we have a message encrypted with key K? In fact, that brings us to the very definition of the word security, because the word security itself is a very wide and very general kind of word and a general notion. And underneath it there are a variety of things that exist. Okay, so the most famous or like sort of most common properties are things like confidentiality or secrecy, integrity, availability, authenticity, non-repudiation, accountability, and so on. So there are when we basically here talk about the security of the communication, we actually need to be more specific in the sense that exactly what does that word security mean, or what kind of properties, specific properties of security we're looking for. So another issue is, or another aspect here of the model that we adopt is the nature of M. Okay, so far we've treated M as if it were just some kind of text. Okay, so like hello world. However, M can be also a previous encrypted message M prime. Okay, so you could have taken hello world, encrypted hello world with K, and the encryption of hello world using K itself, you can treat it as a new message. And then you can go on asking yourself, well, what is M prime in this iterative process? And you can see here where we're getting at, because you can keep on iterating and iterating through these encryptions. So the point B is that, or the point that we want to make here, is that encryption is not just a single layer activity or single layer process, but actually it's an iterative process which can lead to complex structures or complex cryptographic structures. So this is here one very simple sort of complex, simple in the fact that it's linear, but it's still a complex structure where you take a message and you keep on encrypting it with lots of keys. Okay. But you can have more sort of meaningful complex structures where you mix and match the operations. Okay, so you could have something like this, where you take some kind of an encrypted text, another encrypted text using a different key, and the third text which is not encrypted, and you can compose them together in sort of three or a triple, okay, a triple of data. And then here we have taken that triple or triplet of data and we have essentially encrypted it again, composed it with another text, encrypted it again, and finally composed it with an outmost text which is not encrypted itself. So point being made is that you can essentially not just iterate through your cryptographic operations, but you can also compose them. Okay, so you can hence build up rich forms of cryptographic objects, and that will depend very much on the purpose behind these objects, or exactly what you're trying to communicate to the other side, and what's the purpose of your communication. When we encounter something like this, we call it a cryptographic data structure or a cryptographic complex object. So again, it's or a cryptographic object. These are all valid names to give for such kind of data structures. So here's another example of a complex cryptographic structure. And in this case, as you can see, we're not just using cryptography, but we're using some other operations. We will encounter this next week for the when we talk about digital signatures, but this is essentially the a symbol denoting a signature or a digital signature. Okay, so we will see that next week, but essentially this is saying that the whatever is in here, this whole thing is digitally signed using the private key that belongs to Bob. And then we're encountering here some other kind of data, like a timestamp. We have here a generic message M, and in here we have a nonce, or a number that's used once. And all of this essentially is being sort of composed together in one whole complex structure, which at the outermost of it's basically a signature by Alice, or a signature by Alice's private key. Okay. What we will do is we will next week as well explain a few of these other notations. But the important thing is that to note here is that you can construct such complex structures. They're not just cryptography based. They can include other operations which are also sort of sorry, not cryptography, but I meant to say they're not just encryption based, but they could be other cryptographic operations. Okay, so like digital signatures, or as we will see later as well, things like hashing and so on. So far we've talked about cryptography as if it were just symmetric. So you have one key that you use for encryption and the same key that you use for decryption. However, there is another model of cryptography known as asymmetric, and asymmetric cryptography essentially means that the key you use for encryption is different from the key that you use for decryption. Okay, so they're different keys, but they're not unrelated. They are related in the sense that they're both generated from the same random number, or sometimes we call it the seed of these two keys. The two keys that we generate, also we sometimes call them a key pair. Okay, they are a key pair because they are basically related to each other. So let's name this key pair. So the key pair itself has, of course, two keys in it. The first is known as the private key. So this is the key that you keep to yourself, private. No one knows about it, or the owner keeps to themselves as private. No one knows about this key, so therefore it is secret to that owner. On the other hand, the other side of the pair, known as the public key, is advertised to everyone in the world. Okay, so we assume that we have some kind of a directory where we can publish, or online, for example, on some public site, where we can publish our public key. Now, here comes the trick with asymmetric cryptography, is that you can use either to encrypt and then use the other to decrypt. Okay, so if you use the private key to encrypt a message, then you can use the public key to decrypt that message, and similarly, if you use the public key to encrypt, you can use the private key to decrypt. Just note here that if you use the public key to encrypt, you can't use the same public key to decrypt, and the same thing if you use the private key to encrypt, you can't use the same private key to decrypt. Okay, so the way it works is that you use one key for encryption and the other one for decryption. Now, it's very important to note that this sort of order, or the choice that we're making in terms of which key to select for encryption and which ones to select for decryption, actually has a lot of significance when it comes to establishing our security, because the choice that we make will give us one form of security and not the other. Okay, so let's look first of all to the scenario when you encrypt using the public key. So say, for example, you wanted to send a secret message to Bob. In that case, if you pick up Bob's public key, you encrypt the message with their public key, and then you send it down to Bob. Now, of course, here we know from what we said earlier, so from the slide here, we know that only Bob, and only Bob in the whole world, has access to Bob's private key. So as a result, when this message is sent to Bob, whoever sees this encryption will not be able to do anything to it except for Bob. Okay, so Bob will pick up the private key, okay, which was generated in association with this public key, and then we'll use that private key to decrypt this message and release M. Therefore, M is secret between whoever performs the encryption and whoever owns KPR. So that's the conclusion, that M is secret between whoever performs the encryption and whoever owns the private key. And as a result, this order, or this kind of choice that we made, resulted in achieving confidentiality. Okay, so it resulted in achieving confidentiality. Now, by contrast, if you were reversing the order, so instead of choosing the public key to encrypt, you chose your own private key, or the person who is performing the encryption chose their own private key to encrypt a message, then sending that message to the outside world will allow anyone who has access to the public key of that person owning the private key to decrypt the message. Okay, so anyone who owns the public key can decrypt that message, and so as a result, we'll be able to establish that that message came only from Bob or Alice or Carol or whoever it was, because we know that the only person in the world who could have performed this encryption is Alice or Bob or Carol. Okay, because they are the only ones who have access to their own private key. So as a result, even though the message is in this case not secret, so anyone who has access to the public key, and we assume, as we said earlier, as the name implies, that the public key is public, so everybody has access to this public key. Therefore, anybody can read M. Okay, so anybody can extract M. M is not secret here. However, what we are establishing is the source of M. Okay, so the entity or the origin from which M came. So that is known as authenticity, and we were able to achieve authenticity by encrypting using the private key rather than the public key, as we saw in the previous case. Now, if you want to look at this as a model of communication, then you can understand it in the following way, that in order for us to achieve secrecy, or that indeed secrecy is a many-to-one communication. Okay, so many people have access to the public key used for encryption, but when you send it to the other side, or when you sort of release that encrypted message on your public network, then only one person in the world can decrypt it, and that's the owner of the private key corresponding to the public key that was used for encryption. So secrecy is a many-to-one communication model. Okay. By contrast, authenticity is a one-to-many communication model, simply because when you do receive something encrypted with the private key, it is only one person in the world who could have generated that, and that's the owner of that private key. But at the same time, anyone in the world can, using the public key corresponding to that private key, can validate this or can decrypt this message. Okay, so the message, when it arrives at this side, anyone in the world can decrypt it. However, whoever does that will be able to essentially come to the conclusion that the message originally left or was generated by the owner of the private key corresponding to the public key used for decryption. So authenticity as such is then a one-to-many sort of communication model or style. Right, so a slide here on the a bit more on the notation, and particularly what we call scoping, or the scoping of keys, or indeed actually the scoping of other things as well, as we will come across later. But let's talk about keys here, since that's what we've got in this first set of seminar slides. So scoping essentially reflects or expresses the ownership or the access to a certain data. So in this case, it's the access or ownership of keys. Okay, so when we write something like this, we say KPB, meaning it's a public key, and then we say Bob, and then that means that basically Bob is the owner of this public key. It doesn't mean that it's only Bob who can see it, because as we said, it's a public key. Okay, so anybody else in the world can see it. However, it is a public key which Bob generated originally as part of a key pair. When we say something like this, K Alice server, then we mean that this is a key shared between Alice and the server, and if the key is shared between two entities, remember this is sort of like a one-to-one communication, so that implies immediately that the key is a symmetric key. Okay, so we're in the realm of symmetric cryptography in this case. We could write something like this, K Carol, which means that this is a key known only to Carol, okay, or it's a key that Carol generated, and again, this is going to be a symmetric key. So whenever we don't mention PB or PR, then you can make the safe assumption that we're talking about a symmetric key. And that also applies to the case of key K when it has no scope. Okay, so this is a some kind of a symmetric key that has been generated, but we simply don't know who has access to it or who generated it, and therefore who owns this key. So it could be known to absolutely no one. Okay, but it could also be known to everyone. Okay, so simply we cannot make any assumptions about this key, except that because we're not mentioning that it's a PB or PR, then we can safely assume that it's a symmetric key, but we just don't know exactly who owns this key K. So as I said, this kind of notation, or this kind of scoping, sorry, will apply also to other things later. So if we talk about nonces or timestamps, then also if you see a timestamp subscripted with Carol's name, for example, you can assume that this is a timestamp that was generated by Carol. Right, finally, the last or the third property here that we're interested in, as we said, is integrity as part of the sort of sub components of security. We won't dwell much on integrity, but just to say that it is something that you can easily establish using something called cryptographic hash functions. Okay, so cryptographic hash functions are essentially one-way functions that are easily computable in one direction, but very hard or nearly impossible to compute in the reverse direction. And they should be collision resistant. So if you take two different messages or data or texts, then they should not basically generate the same number, and they're deterministic. So they're deterministic in the sense that if you took the same message and you hashed it in the first time, and then again you take the same message and you hash it the second time, then you will always arrive at the same number. Okay, so their purpose is essentially you give a hash function some kind of message, whether it's hello world or text or something else, and it will give you in return back a unique number which corresponds to your message, and that unique number is always the same. So if you hash hello world again, second time, you will arrive again to the same number. So that's all. Thank you very much. Goodbye.